in Indiana claimed that the theme song for Mr. Ed, that old television show about the talking horse, if you played the Mr. Ed theme song backwards, it said Satan is the source.
Misinformation. Misinformation.
Taking scissors to play with the black folk down in Florida. Colored pens and for sexing up the. I'm the someone who knew they're not telling pre-September. I lean on in the loop to help them unremember.
I was flying on UA-93. That shadow in the footage, it was probably me. I'm the rumor, I'm the doubt, I'm the lie. But you wouldn't stand near me if you didn't want to die. Everything you know is wrong. There's a verse missing out of this song. Everything you know is wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. I was there when they landed on the moon, in a studio in Kentucky in June. I've got Kennedy's brain in a jar. If you knew what I knew, you wouldn't laugh so hard. Everything you know is wrong. There's a verse missing out of this song. Everything you know is wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
In the canteen down at Columbine, with the bags they never found, striking matches up at Waco when they burnt it to the ground. Without me,
Oklahoma
wasn't
possible.
at all.
See my silhouette
In the Super 8,
around
grassy knoll.
Everything you know is wrong. There's a verse missing out of this song. Everything you know is wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. Everything you know is wrong. There's a missing out of this song. Everything you know is wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
Roger, flight, we're go. You've got some nice elevated rates, which we expected, and he's really speeding it up, but he looks great. Let's go.
I was in Paris in the underpass. I'm the FO-sponsored Supergrass. I'm Charlie Thrush in Minnesota. And I smuggled hep across the border. Stole Danny Castellaro's memoirs. Put the acid in the reservoirs. I'm Ron Brown's body on the T-43. And I hit those missing WMDs.
And that was Chumbawamba with the track Everything You Know Is Wrong. And if you listen to primarily the corporate media, that might well be the case. But you're not listening to the corporate media, you're listening to Bernie-2020. Greetings and welcome to the Bernie-2020 podcast. This is an independent podcast on progressive politics, inspired by Bernie Sanders and progressive and radical activism. If you want to reach out to me, you can send me a message at bernieus2020@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at bernieus2020. You can also check out all the back episodes and find some links to make a donation. You can make a one-time or recurring donation. You can do all that at bernie-2020.com. So is everything that we know really wrong? Well, a lot of what we think we know might be wrong. Here's a little bit from Mehdi Hassan from a piece published at theintercept.com. Finally, can we all agree everything we were told about Bernie Sanders was wrong? Can we agree in the wake of the primary contests in Iowa, New Hampshire, and now Nevada, that everything we were told about Senator Bernie Sanders was wrong? That the press, the pundits, the politicians were all wrong about him? And not just wrong, but completely, utterly, demonstrably, embarrassingly, catastrophically wrong? You would have to go back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 to find another example of where our political and media elites were so out of step with reality, so off in their predictions and prognostications, so keen to peddle myths and misinformation. On a side note, whenever we mention Iraq, it's always worth recalling how Sanders opposed that disastrous conflict, whereas his rivals Michael Bloomberg and Joe Biden both supported it. Let's consider the nonsense that has passed for, quote, reporting, commentary, and analysis on Sanders over the past year or so. He isn't electable. The 78-year-old independent senator from Vermont goes, the argument is too old and too kooky to win. And also, Americans won't vote for a socialist. Yet, in the wake of his blowout victory in the Nevada caucuses on Saturday, Sanders has won the popular vote in every single one of the first 3 states. You might think the concept of electability should be connected somehow to, actually winning elections. But those are primaries. How about the general election? Well, at least according to the latest national CBS YouGov head-to-head polling, Sanders beats Donald Trump by a slightly bigger margin than any of his Democratic rivals. Forget national polls. What about the battleground states in the Rust Belt? According to the latest UW-Madison Elections Research Center survey, Sanders has a bigger lead over Trump in Michigan and Pennsylvania than all of his Democratic rivals, and the same 2-point lead over Trump in Wisconsin as Biden and Elizabeth Warren. By the way, does anyone with a brain really believe that Bloomberg, an elite billionaire from New York, has a better chance of winning the Rust Belt than Sanders, a working-class socialist from Vermont? He has a ceiling on his support. Sanders said the critics wouldn't be able to reach out beyond the left, beyond young voters, beyond his base. In Nevada, however, Sanders won a plurality of self-identified moderate or conservative Democrats. In fact, as the Washington Post's Matt Visor tweeted, quote, the Sanders win was emphatic. He prevailed among those with college degrees and those without, in union and non-union households, in every age group except over 65, and even narrowly carried moderates and conservatives. Sanders' critics have long ignored the reality that the senator from Vermont is popular with grassroots Democrats of all backgrounds. Not only is he the most popular member of the Senate, but he also has the highest net favorables of any presidential candidate with Democratic voters. He also happens to be the candidate who the biggest proportion of Democrats, quote, expect to prevail against Trump. As Peter Beinart noted in The Atlantic last week, quote, across the ideological spectrum, ordinary Democrats like Bernie Sanders. Some on the right of the party have tried to argue that Sanders has been benefiting from his, quote, moderate opponents splitting the vote between them. They have pointed to the fact that Iowa gave 54% of its votes to Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Biden combined, versus 44% to Sanders and Warren. While New Hampshire gave 53% to the three moderates versus 35% to the two progressives. Yet in Nevada, Sanders alone won more votes than Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden combined, and in head-to-head matchups, Sanders beats each and every one of his Democratic rivals, including Bloomberg, by 15 points. He has a problem with people of color. The long-standing argument that Sanders struggles with Black and Latino voters, that his supporters tend to be white, male, quote, Bernie bros, is perhaps the most pernicious and dishonest anti-Sanders argument of them all. After 3 contests, it's clear that the Jewish senator from Vermont is now heading a multiracial, multi-faith coalition of both of Democrats and independents. In Nevada this past weekend, he is estimated to have won a whopping 70% of the Latino vote. Meanwhile, among black voters nationally, Sanders is now a virtual dead heat with Biden, who we were told had a, quote, lock on this particular minority community. Is it any wonder then that in South Carolina, often described as Biden's, quote, firewall state, because black voters make up at least 60% of the Democratic electorate, Sanders has been able to slash the former vice president's lead from 29 points last month to just 5 points last week. His policies are extreme and unpopular. Sanders, goes the argument, is a socialist who backs radical policies too far to the left of not just the electorate as a whole, but even mainstream and moderate Democratic voters. Yet in Iowa and New Hampshire, as I pointed out earlier, a clear majority of caucus goers and primary voters backed Medicare for All over the current private insurance system. In Nevada, too, 6 in 10 Democrats said they supported a Sanders-style single-payer health care system. At a national level, a narrower majority of Americans support Medicare for All, according to the latest Kaiser Family Foundation poll. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, then, it is Sanders and not Biden or Bloomberg who is the real centrist candidate in terms of pushing policies popular with most Americans. So will Bernie Sanders secure the Democratic presidential nomination at this summer's Democratic National Convention? Probably. Will he defeat Trump in November? No idea. The point is, however, that he can win. He has as much chance as any other candidate, if not a better chance. Anyone telling you otherwise is a liar, or a fool, or both. Next up is a piece published at fair.org, and this is written by Jim Narekis. Bernie Sanders plunges to first place. Remember when the big winner of New Hampshire was third-place finisher Amy Klobuchar? Quote, Bernie Sanders may have come in first in New Hampshire, but Amy Klobuchar won. Bloomberg, the news organization, declared. The media company, not the billionaire candidate who owns it. I guess I didn't have to add that news corporation in there. So let me take that out. Where am I? Bernie Sanders plunges to first place. Quote, Bernie Sanders may have come in first in New Hampshire, but Amy Klobuchar won. Bloomberg declared. The media company, not the billionaire candidate who owns it. I would almost argue that a third-place finish for Amy would be stronger and more important than a first-place finish for Bernie, MSNBC commentator Adrian Elrod asserted. That's not how it worked out, of course. Since February 14, Bernie Sanders has gone from a 4-point lead to a 12-point lead over his closest rival, Joe Biden, in national polling averages, while Klobuchar remains in 5th place. In the Nevada caucuses held February 22, Sanders got twice as many final votes as number 2 Biden, whom Sanders was trailing in the polls as recently as 10 days earlier. Caucus entrance polls found the Vermont senator was top choice of both men and women, whites and Latinos, though not African Americans, where he was second to Biden. All age groups except those 65 and older, Democrats and independents, union households and non-union households, and those with and without college degrees. He had the most support among those described as, quote, very liberal and somewhat liberal, and tied Biden among those labeled moderate or conservative. So while there's still some coverage that might be said to be stuck in the denial stage about Sanders, quote, Nevada caucus's win would make Bernie Sanders a weak frontrunner, Washington Examiner, was a late entry into that genre. For the most part, corporate media have moved on to the next stage of grieving, which is anger. And this piece goes on quite a bit about a number of specific commentaries by the corporate media against Sanders, but I'm not going to go through all that garbage here in this episode. I've talked about some of it in the past. I'll probably hit a couple pieces in some of the stories coming up, but there's plenty of garbage news out there about Bernie. Plenty of attacks, plenty of hand-wringing and hair-pulling by the establishment and the corporate media. I'm not going to bury you with that here. So up next, from InTheseTimes.com, a story written by Hamilton Nolan. New England UAW workers join parade of local unions endorsing Bernie Sanders. A New England United Automobile Workers local this week voted to endorse Senator Bernie Sanders for president, the latest in a stream of union locals across America, backing Sanders even when their national parent unions have not issued endorsements. The executive board of UAW Local 2322, representing about 5,000 workers in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, voted to endorse the Sanders campaign, reported here for the first time. Aeneas Serkin, the local's president, said the board chose to endorse based on widespread support of Sanders by the members, and as a result of frustration with the UAW International's lack of a process for backing candidates in the Democratic primary. Quote, what are they going to do to us as a local if we endorse, Serkin said. We can and should express the will of the membership. The Sanders campaign isn't focused just on the national leadership of unions. It's focused on member-to-member communications. Local 2322 is an amalgamation of 27 different shops, including graduate student workers, child care workers, healthcare workers, and teachers. There was not a vote of the full membership regarding the endorsement, but the board plans to bring its endorsement to a meeting of joint council of all the bargaining units later this week and expects to gain their formal support. The UAW, like many national unions, has not endorsed a candidate in the Democratic primary. Despite the decision of some national unions to bide their time until the general election, the Sanders campaign has been picking up endorsements from local unions across the country all year. In January, Sanders won the endorsement of a 10,000-member SEIU branch in New Hampshire. In February, 7,000 members of the American Federation of Musicians in Los Angeles backed him. Last week, he picked up the endorsement of UFCW 21, a 46,000-member local in Washington state. This week, he was endorsed by AFGE Local 704, a notable high-profile endorsement from federal workers at the Environmental Protection Agency. His campaign has also been endorsed by tens of thousands of people collectively represented by locals of AFS-CME, CWA, Unite Here, and other unions that chose not to issue primary endorsements on the national level. National unions that have chosen to endorse candidates in the primary other than Sanders have risked an internal backlash. Last week, Sanders supporters within IBEW released a letter signed by 1,300 members calling on their parent union to retract its endorsement of Joe Biden. The Amalgamated Transit Union, which endorsed Biden this month after backing Bernie in 2016, is also the subject of an internal effort by Sanders supporters to get that endorsement retracted. And the leadership of the Culinary Union, the powerful Unite Here local in Las Vegas, found itself at the center of a week-long hostile news cycle after it tried to dissuade members from voting for Sanders because of his support for Medicare for all, only to see him win the Nevada caucus with strong support from those very Culinary Union members. And from union endorsements to endorsements of another kind, this piece is published at Reuters.com, written by Ginger Gibson. Marianne Williamson, who made an unsuccessful bid for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, has thrown her support behind former rival Bernie Sanders, appearing at a rally in Texas with the progressive senator. Quote, "Bernie Sanders has been taking a stand for a very long time," she told the Sanders rally in Austin. "We're here and we're with Bernie." Sanders appears to be gaining momentum in the Democratic nominating contest after winning in both New Hampshire and Nevada. Williamson, a self-help guru, has a faithful following but failed to gain traction beyond her more devout fans. And then on to a story here in my home state in New Jersey. This is published at NewJerseyGlobe.com. And it really speaks loudly to the, I'll say, concern among some about the Sanders candidacy and what it means. Democratic State Chairman John Curry today signaled his support to U.S. Senator Bob Menendez's proposal to open, and this, I think this is written incorrectly, to hold an open presidential primary and not award organization lines. Quote, "I believe that Senator Menendez's idea to hold a statewide open presidential primary has merit," Curry said. "An open primary would allow all New Jersey Democrats to support the presidential candidate of their choice without causing unnecessary divisiveness that could carry over after the primary. And we must do whatever we can to ensure Democratic unity as we work to defeat President Trump." Curry's move suggests support for the Menendez plan from Governor Phil Murphy, who has, as recently as this week, said he had not considered any issues relating to ending organizational lines in presidential and other primary races. It also means that Passaic County could hold an open primary for president. Now, what this means is that New Jersey may be on the verge, at least for this specific election, of killing one of the worst components of the Democratic Party machine rule in New Jersey that exists. Ballots in New Jersey use lines, which means the primary race that is going on, the leader in that race. So in this case, in the primary, we've got a presidential contest or a nomination for a president contest. So that would be the lead candidate on the ballot. And I'm not an expert here, but I'll share what I know. And if any of the experts are out there, you can certainly correct whatever I might misstate. But each of those candidates who qualify for the ballot at the presidential level will get a line. And underneath those candidates, or on that same line as those candidates, other candidates can line up. And what this means is it is very easy to identify which candidates are more aligned with each other as far as policy goes. The big problem with this in New Jersey, this go around, is that Bernie is really, really strong, and they recognize it. If they didn't feel the strength of Bernie Sanders, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't care who was lined up on Bernie's line. They wouldn't care what candidates in other races, down ticket candidates. Remember all the talk about Bernie's going to do so much harm to down ticket candidates? Well, here in New Jersey, they're really, really afraid that Bernie's going to be so strong. He's going to have so much uplift on down ticket candidates. And guess what? Those down ticket candidates are mostly challenging Democratic candidates that already exist. Obviously, this is a Democratic primary in the Democratic ballot. So there's a number of good candidates in my district. I live in New Jersey, District 5 for the House of Representatives. We have Mr. Josh Gottheimer as our current representative. He is awful. He is one of the most conservative Democrats that it's out there. And it doesn't mean everything he does is bad. It doesn't mean that I disagree with everything he does. But on certain specific key issues, on Medicare for all and on free college tuition, he said they're never going to happen. That's his position. They're never going to happen. You know why? He doesn't want them to happen. He's in the pocket of big money, very clearly and obviously. And he's part of the Problem Solvers Caucus. If you know the third way, then you know the Problem Solvers Caucus. They are extreme centrists. They are Congress people that tout working across the aisle. I don't have no problem with working across the aisle, but I have a major problem with starting at the point of compromise and not standing up for what we really need. And what we really need are the progressive ideas that Bernie Sanders espouses. So up against Josh Gottheimer in my district is Arati. And of course I'm not remembering Arati's last name at the moment. So let me look it up. Oh, it's Kribosh, if I'm pronouncing it right. Arati Kribosh. Yeah, I think maybe it's Kribosh. Arati is running. You can find out more about Arati if you're here in New Jersey and in New Jersey District 5 at Arati, that's ARATI, for Congress.com. Arati stands for the Green New Deal. Another thing that Gottheimer said, not going to happen. Arati stands for Medicare for All. Common Dreams headline, moral courage and conviction behind primary challenger to Representative Josh Gottheimer, one of the most conservative House Democrats. This is what really, really frightens the Democratic machine party machine in New Jersey. The Democratic Party insiders own who's going to run, how they're going to run, when they're going to run. And this is one of the first elections. I haven't been in New Jersey all that long, several years now, but not certainly a lifelong resident. This is one of the first elections I've seen where there are progressives challenging conservative incumbent Democrats across the state. There are easily 5 or 6 progressives running for the House of Representatives in New Jersey against more conservative Democratic representatives that actually hold those seats. The Democrats flipped almost every seat in New Jersey in 2018. Only one Republican remained, although now we have 2. Thank you very little. Jeff Van Drew, who flipped from Democrat. He ran as a Democrat and won, beating some very good opponents in that primary race because guess what? It's that Democratic machine. that supported Jeff Van Drew ushered him into the House of Representatives, where he then flipped and became a Republican. So now we have 2 Republicans. So there's a ton of fear that the power of the Bernie Sanders campaign, given a standard ballot with the regular lines that it's had in the past, is going to propel these other progressives to victories over the current representatives that we have. And from my point of view, that would be a fantastic and amazing thing. On top of those running for representative, we have 2 really good, strong progressives running for U.S. Senate for Cory Booker's seat against Cory Booker. We have a gentleman last name of Hamm, Hamm, and we have Lisa McCormick, who ran against Menendez in the last election. Both very good, very strong progressives running for the nomination for Senate. So one of them ending up on Bernie Sanders' line is going to get a big boost. So in any event, that's enough about New Jersey, but clear fear among the party insiders in New Jersey of the Bernie effect and how it could drive a lot of progressives into the race and give them a fighting chance to win. This next piece is published at earther.gizmodo.com. On Sunday, the Washington Post published an opinion piece by Fred Hyatt, the opinion page's editor, entitled "How Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders Both Reject the Reality of Climate Change." This false equivalence is, to put it bluntly, absolutely one of the most idiotic things I have ever seen. Hyatt's piece inexplicably attacks the climate plan Senator Bernie Sanders would implement as president. Here's our analysis, and I'm going to read through their analysis in a couple minutes. While there are valid things to quibble with, Hyatt does a lot of hand-waving. But how would we pay for it? Stuff, and hand-wringing over the idea that fossil fuel companies and the executives who run them should be prosecuted. He then turns to extensively quoting and paraphrase Patrick Pouyanné, the chairman and CEO of Total, checks notes, large Paris-based oil giant currently being sued in France. The whole post reads like an advertorial for Total, which isn't out of the question. Those a lot of what passes for op-ed opinion pieces are written by lobbyists and supporters of companies and PR companies that are hired by corporations to push narratives. So take anything on the op-ed page that talks about this kind of stuff, that talks about economics, that talks about corporations and products with a giant grain of salt. The whole post reads like an advertorial for Total and a carbon tax plan supported by the Climate Leadership Council, a group supported by Big Oil, including Total. And here is a letter that is in response, or that is about Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, that offers a different point of view from that op-ed. Joe Biden says Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal is impossible. We refuse that narrative. We are scientists here to refute Biden's claim that, quote, not a single solitary scientist thinks that Sanders' Green New Deal would work. Not only do we believe that it's possible for the U.S. to decarbonize electricity and transportation by 2030, we know that such a goal is imperative. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's primary scientific authority on climate change, has been describing the immense harm that climate change will bring to the world and its peoples for decades. In 2018, it issued a report focused on the likely impacts of allowing global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial warming, concluding in its famously measured phrasing that the global impacts of such warming are going to be bad. One example, quote, any increase in global warming is projected to affect human health with primarily negative consequences. High confidence. Nonetheless, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius can protect people and our planet from the most extreme anticipated consequences of climate change. The planet has already warmed 0.8 to 1.2 degrees Celsius, 1.4 to 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit, with an estimated future warming trajectory of 0.1 to 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. Global mean sea level has already risen 8 to 9 inches since 1880 and is expected to rise by another 10 to 30 inches by 2100, under a 1.5 degrees constraint, or more if we go past that. We are running out of time. We know we must act, constraining climate change in a way that is most protective of our planet, our families, and our homes, requires cutting greenhouse gas emissions rapidly and permanently. We believe that Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal proposal lays out a course of action that is matched to the scale of the challenge. It is possible, but we must commit wholeheartedly. Sanders' Green New Deal is informed by science, linking its targets and timelines to what the science tells us is critical for staving off the most devastating impacts of climate change. Just as importantly, it understands the challenge for what it is, a need to transform our economy to support a more sustainable, healthier future. Accordingly, it addresses decarbonization systematically, focusing on where money needs to be spent, where social programs need to be implemented, and where people need support to do great things. The plan funds new, clean energy, leveraging successful New Deal models of public financing and control of power generation, and fully funds a just 5-year transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry. The plan recognizes climate change as an emergency. It would make the U.S. a global leader on climate action while ensuring funding for a just transition and industrialization of the developing world. And perhaps most importantly, the plan reflects that it is the American people who will make this happen. That's why Sanders' Green New Deal focuses on jobs, justice, and public ownership of the energy systems that we create, and will be bolstered by other policy commitments like Medicare for All, student loan forgiveness, union empowerment, and other programs that recognize the power and dignity of all. We know that it is possible to rise to the challenge of the climate crisis, and we know that Sanders' Green New Deal is a commitment to people that recognizes that only together can we make this deeply ambitious and critically necessary plan work. As President John F. Kennedy said to Congress at the advent of the space race, quote, I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment. It is again time to take urgent, visionary actions that rise to the challenge that we as scientists know is coming. It is time to commit to a Green New Deal. And at the beginning of this piece, it mentioned Bernie Sanders' plan and then had a link saying, here's our analysis. So here is that analysis. This again is from earther.gizmodo.com. Bernie Sanders' $16 trillion climate plan is nothing short of a revolution. On Thursday, Bernie Sanders released his long-awaited presidential climate plan, and folks, Bernie is gonna Bernie. You can hear his voice in everything as it spits hot fire about prosecuting the fossil fuel industry, uplifting workers, and creating a whole swath of new public works programs and infrastructure. It also calls for 100% renewable energy for transportation and electricity sectors by 2030, while eschewing nuclear power and demilitarizing the world, setting a goal that's somewhere between wildly ambitious and out of reach. In that regard, it perfectly captures the iconoclastic nature of the Vermont senator himself. But whether it can be implemented is a big question mark. Former presidential candidate Jay Inslee, who exited the 2020 race on Wednesday, made waves when he announced a $9 trillion plan to combat climate change, a large portion of which would be leveraged investments from the private sector. Sanders' plan goes much, much further. It guarantees a $16.3 trillion investment through 2030 to radically reshape American life and address the climate crisis. The plan itself doesn't focus on where the money will come from, though the campaign did say it would come in part from new taxes on the rich, raising revenue from the plan itself, reduced social safety net costs, and a few other sources. Instead, it focuses on who gets the money. The plan commits trillions of dollars to grants for low and middle income families to do everything from home weatherization to buying a new electric vehicle, and it would create a whole new host of publicly owned energy and internet infrastructure. It also uses language like, we will spend, we plan to provide, and give. I'm not going to all, but how will we pay for it, given that we need a livable planet? But the language and the recipients themselves are the message. This is a goddamn revolution. Quote, the entire system would have to change. That's how Bernie operates. He draws outside the lines. Among the outlays, Sanders would commit $2.37 trillion to renewable energy and storage, which the plan says would be enough of an investment to meet the country's energy needs. Any renewable energy the government generates would be publicly owned, and a Sanders administration would prioritize selling it to publicly owned utilities and cooperatives at current rates to keep costs down. The campaign estimates that alone would raise $6.4 trillion of the $16.3 trillion needed to fund the transition. The plan highlights this under a bullet point about needing to, quote, end greed in our energy system. So while this story has a couple times said the how you're going to pay for it line, that plan does have some specifics within it about how money will be raised. To that end, the plan also says Sanders would instruct the Department of Justice to go after fossil fuel companies for both civil and criminal penalties. So far, cases winding through the state court systems have largely failed to hold big oil accountable for lying to everyone, from the public to shareholders. There may be a federal precedent, though. Michael Girard, the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, told Earther that Sanders, quote, is trying to replicate and go beyond what happened in 2006, when after a lengthy trial, DOJ obtained the civil conviction of 11 major tobacco companies under the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization, RICO. The result of that case changed how Big Tobacco could advertise and forced them to issue corrective statements about the adverse effects of smoking, though no fines were levied. I would venture to guess Sanders' DOJ would hope for a stronger outcome. Then there's the transportation sector, which is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. Sanders would provide more than $2 trillion in grants for low and middle income families, as well as small businesses to buy electric vehicles. It would also invest heavily in public transit, electric buses, high-speed rail, as the plan notes. Together, we will create the movement needed to see high-speed rail come. Quote, the recognition that electrifying vehicles and decarbonizing the grid entirely are not only both entirely possible, but they are cost-effective and are doubly so when done together. Daniel Kamen, an energy researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, told Earther. The 2030 goal for 100% clean electricity and 100% EV use will draw the most fire. but it is a goal worth fighting for. The thing is, Sanders won't make this easy. The plan explicitly says it will not rely on nuclear power, a move that will resonate with activists but could also wreak havoc on the electrical grid. Nuclear provides a baseline type of energy because it can, if needed, always be on. Quote, does that mean that all existing nuclear plants that are still running in 2030 would be shut down? Costa Samaras, the director of Carnegie Mellon's Center for Engineering and Resilience for Climate Adaptation, told Earther, that seems like an unnecessary fight and expense at a time where every bit of carbon reduction counts. Renewables like wind and solar only provide power when the wind blows or the sun shines. The plan calls for big investments in energy storage, which will be crucial to have any shot at working, but it could wreak havoc with the grid and everything that relies on it. And I'm with Sanders on this one. I don't buy that nuclear is worth investing in. Sure, there's existing nuclear, and it can continue to operate. And I don't think there is a fast track for decommissioning that nuclear unless it's already towards the end of its life and becoming less reliable and more dangerous. But the cost of getting new nuclear off the ground and the massive expense of that, in addition to the harm that fuel causes in all steps of its lifetime, from mining to disposal, is too big of a cost. When wind and sun and hydro and wave and geothermal are all less harmful to the environment, not non-harmful to the environment. You still have mining to get materials to build solar panels, etc., but less harmful to the environment. Let's see. Beyond Democrats holding the House, Sanders would also need the Senate to flip Democrat and abolish the filibuster, something he supports. Actually, I don't know that that's accurate. From what I hear, Bernie does not support abolishing the filibuster. He definitely supports flipping the Senate Democrat. Otherwise, this whole plan depends on a whole lot of executive actions and agency directives that are likely to get tied up in court. Ethan Elkin, director of the Climate Change and Business Program at the University of California, Berkeley, told Earther that, quote, legislation from Congress would be much faster and more legally secure. All of this is the easy stuff compared to Sanders' international ambitions. The plan calls for working with the Global South minus China to reduce emissions 36% by 2030, a move that would chart a new world order and economy. Beyond that, Sanders plans to tackle world peace. Specifically, the plan calls for bringing together, quote, major industrialized nations with the goal of using the trillions of dollars our nations spend on misguided wars and weapons of mass destruction to instead work together internationally to combat our climate crisis and take on the fossil fuel industry. No biggie. At the end of the day, Sanders' plan is a $16.3 trillion microcosm of his entire ethos. His theory of change is that the system is broken, so we have to tear it down and start anew. Reading his plan, it's clear he's not messing around about the idea of revolution, but it also fails to offer a clear roadmap with guideposts along the way, aside from the carcasses of the fossil fuel industry and a slew of publicly owned goods. Occasionally it veers into the realm of dreams, at least if you believe we have to keep operating in the current system and world order that exists. Quote, let's just say we have a political revolution and Bernie is president, Stokes said, trying to imagine how this plan would actually play out. Whatever you imagine comes next will probably clarify whether you're actually ready for the revolution or not. And just yesterday, after many, many people saying over and over and over, sometimes with genuine interest and more often I feel derisively, how is Bernie going to pay for it? And I think that mostly that has been really, really lazy journalism, because Bernie has all along the way put out plans, put out sources of income. If you look at Bernie Sanders' issue page, there's at least 3 different policy issues on tax revenue and raising tax revenue from new sources that haven't been tapped yet. And I think 3 is an understatement on that. About Bernie's Medicare for All plan that he's been talking about for decades. How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it comes up. More than a year ago, Bernie put out a whole white paper on how he might pay for Medicare for All. So I think the highest percentage of people asking, and when I say people, I mostly mean the corporate media, but also echoed over and over and over again in social media. I think the majority of those asking how are you going to pay for it are just too lazy to look. If they looked, they would see a lot of different ways to pay for it. So in a recent interview, the question was asked again, and Bernie fumbled the ball. He didn't have a good solid answer. And so he's made up for it the next day. He put together a whole plan about how he's going to pay for it, which is mostly just relisting what he has already said elsewhere. But in any event, for those of you who haven't heard before how he is going to pay for it, here's his plan on how to pay for it. You can find all of Bernie Sanders' issues at berniesanders.com/issues. This one is titled, How Does Bernie Pay for His Major Plans? Details. College for all and cancel student debt, 2 major parts of Bernie's programs to create a better society for all of us. It will cost $2.2 trillion to make public colleges, universities, and trade schools tuition free and to cancel all student debt over the next decade. It is fully paid for by a modest tax on Wall Street speculation that will raise an estimated $2.4 trillion over 10 years. And there's a link for you to read the entire plan. And there's also actual legislation. That actual legislation is called, let me look up the name here, the Inclusive Prosperity Act of 2019. That is the transaction tax bill that Bernie Sanders is proposing that will raise the money to pay for his College for All and cancel student debt programs. Expanding Social Security. Bernie's bill, that means there's legislation. You can look it up. To expand Social Security will increase benefits for low-income senior citizens and people with disabilities by more than $1,300 a year. It is fully paid for by making the wealthiest 1.8% of Americans. So if you're not one of the wealthiest 1.8% of Americans, don't worry about it. Those with incomes over $250,000 a year. Again, if that's not you, then this is good. Pay the same rate into Social Security as working families. What? Bernie wants the people making over $250,000 a year pay the same as working families pay? This is outrageous. This bill will also extend the solvency of Social Security into the year 2070, ensuring that Social Security can pay every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 50 years. And again, there's a link to read the plan on expanding Social Security. Housing for all. Bernie's proposal to guarantee housing as a human right and to eliminate homelessness will cost $2.5 trillion over the next decade. It is fully paid for by a wealth tax on the top 1/10 of 1%. I think that's Bloomberg level. Those who have a net worth of at least $32 million. Oh, that's not even near Bloomberg level, but of course he's going to be included. Bernie's wealth tax will raise a total of $4.35 trillion. There you go. Housing for all plan that costs $2.5 trillion will be paid for.
There comes a
in
time
part
when the operation
from
of the machine is so
$4.35
odious
trillion
that you cannot even
tax
tacitly participate.
on
You've
wealth.
got to place your bodies on the gears, the wheels,
And you can
all
read that
the
plan
mechanism,
as well
and you've got
with
to
a link.
indicate to those who own it and those who
Universal
run it that
child
unless
care
you are
and
free,
pre-K.
the
This is one of
machine
Bernie's
will be
most recent
prevented
proposals.
From working
Bernie's
at
proposal
all.
to guarantee universal child care and preschool to every family in America who needs it will cost $1.5 trillion. It is fully paid for by a wealth tax on the top 1/10 of 1%. Once again, those who have a net worth of at least $32 million. So that is another portion of the $4.35 trillion raised by the wealth tax. Part of that will pay for universal child care and pre-K for everyone who needs it. Eliminating medical debt. Bernie has introduced a proposal to eliminate all of the $81 billion in past due medical debt held by 79 million Americans. It is fully paid for by establishing an income inequality tax on large corporations that pay CEOs at least 50 times more than average workers. And this is an extensive plan on Bernie's site. You can follow the link here or go to berniesanders.com/issues and look up that his plan for taxing corporations that pay CEOs at least 50 times more than average workers. And if they pay 300 times more than their average workers, they'll even pay more in that tax. That tax will cover eliminating medical debt. The Green New Deal. The $16.3 trillion climate change proposal that Bernie has introduced will fundamentally transform our energy system away from fossil fuels and towards energy efficiency and renewable energy. It will also create 20 million good-paying union jobs in the process. It is fully paid for by raising $3.085 trillion by making the fossil fuel industry pay for their pollution through litigation, fees, and taxes, and eliminating federal fossil fuel subsidies. We already spend an enormous amount of money on fossil fuel subsidies. If we pull those back and invest those differently, that is how we will be able to afford a portion of the Green New Deal. Generating $6.4 trillion in revenue from the wholesale of energy produced by the regional power marketing administrations. This revenue will be collected from 2023 to 2035. And after 2035, electricity will be virtually free aside from operations and maintenance costs. This is one of the big benefits of moving to a energy production system that doesn't use fossil fuels, because mining and drilling and extracting and transporting fossil fuels is very expensive, both in the actual process, the actual cost of doing it, which means in the ultimate cost of those products, and in all of the subsidies that we talked about before that we offer those companies and organizations doing so. The wind as a fuel doesn't cost you anything, nor does the sun, nor does the geothermal energy under the ground, nor do the waves of the rising oceans. As a fuel source, those things are free. So operations and maintenance will always still be costs in generating electricity. But if you shift from fossil fuels, those expensive fuels to extract and use, to free sources of fuel to generate your energy, generate your electricity, then you're going to save a lot of money in the long run. Reducing defense spending by $1.215 trillion by scaling back military operations on protecting the global oil supply. A lot of what we do militarily is to control the supply of fossil fuels around the globe. If we no longer need those fossil fuels, we will no longer need to spend so much money controlling and quote-unquote protecting those things. Collect $2.3 trillion in new income tax revenue from the 20 million new jobs created by the plan. Oh yeah, this plan puts 20 million people to work, or gives 20 million people more opportunities to work, better, higher paying jobs, and all of those people as every company that wants to put jobs anywhere, in any town and wants to get a big tax break to do so, will tell you that all those jobs created have a effect on the economy, because if I pay you $15 an hour or $50 an hour, you're going to spend your money in the economy, and it has these, I don't want to call it trickle down effects because that's a really dirty word, but it has ripple effects in the economy, including all of those people with all of those jobs earning all of that money will pay taxes on it. Saving $1.31 trillion by reducing the need for federal and state safety net spending due to the creation of millions of good-paying unionized jobs. Raising $2 trillion in revenue by making large corporations pay their fair share of taxes. Key points. By averting climate catastrophe, we will save $2.9 trillion over 10 years, $21 trillion over 30 years, and $70.4 trillion over 80 years. If we do not act, the U.S. will lose $34.5 trillion by the end of the century in economic productivity. Yeah, that's the other way that I read a piece in the last episode by Robert Reich, and he said, everyone asks what the cost of doing something is, but nobody asks, what are the costs of not doing it? How much more is it going to cost us in the longer run to not spend money now and do things? Medicare for all. According to a February 15, 2020 study by epidemiologists at Yale University, the Medicare for All bill that Bernie wrote would save over $450 billion in healthcare costs and prevent 68,000 unnecessary deaths each and every year. What our current system costs over the next decade. Over the next 10 years, national health expenditures are projected to total approximately $52 trillion if we keep our current dysfunctional system. How much will we save? According to the Yale study and others, Medicare for All will save approximately $5 trillion over that same time period. $52 trillion minus $5 trillion is $47 trillion total. That is the total expected expenditure as we move to Medicare for All, as opposed to our current spending on the system we have now. How we pay for it. Current federal, state, and local government spending over the next 10 years is projected to total about $30 trillion. So we already are paying. The governments in federal, state, and local governments are already covering $30 trillion of what will be expected to be a $47 trillion cost of medical care over the next 10 years in the U.S. The revenue options Bernie has proposed total $17.5 trillion. $30 trillion plus $17.5 trillion is $47.5 trillion total. And here Bernie has some links to some additional resources. Since 2016, Bernie has proposed a menu of financing options that would more than pay for Medicare for All legislation he has introduced according to the Yale study. These options include creating a 4% income-based premium paid by employees, exempting the first $29,000 in income for a family of 4. In 2018, the typical working family paid an average of $6,015 in premiums to private health insurance companies. Under this option, a typical family of 4 earning $60,000 would pay a 4% income-based premium to fund Medicare for All on income above $29,000. In this example, $1,240 a year, saving that family $4,775 a year. Families of 4 making less than $29,000 a year would not pay this premium. Revenue raised about $4 trillion over 10 years. Imposing a 7.5% income-based premium paid by employers, exempting the first $1 million in payroll to protect small businesses. In 2018, employers paid an average of $14,561 in private health insurance premiums for a worker with a family of 4. Under this option, employers would pay a 7.5% payroll tax to help finance Medicare for all. Just $4,500, a savings of more than $10,000 a year. Revenue raised over $5.2 trillion over 10 years. Eliminating health tax expenditures which would no longer be needed under Medicare for all. Revenue raised about $3 trillion over 10 years. Raising the top marginal income tax rate to 52% on income over $10 million. Revenue raised about $700 billion over 10 years. And I'm going to pause on this one because I've seen in social media either people who are just generally not knowledgeable about what marginal income tax rates are, or people who are just purposely flailing against anything Bernie Sanders. I've seen at least 2 posts in the last week that said Bernie is going to tax you 52%. You're going to pay 52% on everything over $29,000. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding on marginal income tax rates. And I once totally had no idea what a marginal income tax rate meant. Marginal income tax rates, the reason that this sentence says on income over $10 million is a marginal income tax rate applies only above a specific level. So that means your first $10 million do not get taxed at 52%. They get taxed at some amount that is, I don't know, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 35% at the moment is what your taxes on your income above a certain amount up to 10 million probably get at the moment. 52% would kick in at 10 million, which means if you earn $10,001, this marginal tax rate will cost you 52 cents on your $10,001 because you're only paying it on your $1. Only $1, 52% is only on that $1. So if you make $20 million, then 10 million of your 20 million would be hit by the 52% rate. And that's all fine with me. Replacing the cap on state and local tax deductions with an overall dollar cap of $50,000 for a married couple on all itemized deductions. Revenue raised about $400 billion over 10 years. Taxing capital gains at the same rates as income from wages and cracking down on gaming through derivatives, like-kind exchanges, and the zero tax rate on capital gains passed on through bequests. And this makes me angry. It makes me angry because, in my opinion, capital gains should be taxed at double the rate of income from wages. There is no good reason that someone who does nothing but invests their money gets taxed less on their income gains, on what they gain from it, than someone who works their ass off every day, busts their butt to take in a wage from working. The capital gains tax should be doubled, and the income from wages should be reduced proportionally. Revenue raised about $2.5 trillion over 10 years. Enacting the For the 99.8% Act. Again, this is a piece of legislation that's out there, which returns the estate tax exemption to the 2009 level of $3.5 million, which is way too high. Closes egregious loopholes and increases rates progressively, including by adding a top rate of 77% on estate values in excess of $1 billion. Again, it's only 77% on the amount above $1 billion. Don't shit yourself. Your $1 billion is safe. Revenue raised $336 billion over 10 years. Enacting corporate tax reform, including restoring the top federal corporate income tax rate to 35%. Revenue raised $3 trillion, of which $1 trillion would be used to help finance Medicare for all, and $2 trillion would be used for the Green New Deal. Using $350 billion of the amount raised from the tax on extreme wealth to help finance Medicare for all, care costs, and prevent 68,000 unnecessary deaths each and every year. Since 2016, Bernie has proposed a menu of financing options that would more than pay for Medicare for All legislation he has introduced, according to the Yale study. And I think this is about to repeat some of what we just learned. So it looks like, I don't know if this says different language. This looks like the same language we read up above. So it looks like this actually repeats what I've already covered. So there you go. There are the many, many ways that Bernie Sanders is going to pay for his major plans in his platform. And that'll bring us to the last story of this episode. This piece is published at chicago.suntimes.com. This is written by Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1984 and 1988, I believe. Jesse Jackson is the first candidate for president that I was eligible to vote for and was happy to vote for. He, unfortunately, until Bernie came along, was the last, well, not quite the last Democratic presidential candidate I was happy to vote for. I was happy to vote for Dennis Kucinich when Dennis Kucinich ran as well. But if you're on the left side of the spectrum, you don't even have to be that far left because of the nature of the spectrum in the U.S. If you're on the left side of the spectrum, good options from the Democratic Party are few and far between. Jesse Jackson was one of those good options. And here's his piece about democratic socialism. The important word in democratic socialism is democratic. Senator Bernie Sanders isn't talking about making America into Cuba or Venezuela. He is talking about extending social guarantees like those offered in other advanced countries, such as Denmark and Sweden. After the Nevada caucuses, Bernie Sanders is now the frontrunner in the Democratic presidential race. In South Carolina, the next primary, former Vice President Joe Biden is the favorite, buoyed by his support among African American voters. But Sanders will come into the state with real momentum, having won the popular vote in each of the first three contests. More importantly, in Nevada, Sanders revealed the breadth of his growing coalition. He led the field among men and women, among whites and Latinos, among union households and non-union households, among voters of all ages except those over 35, among Democrats who called themselves liberals, moderates, and conservatives. Equally important, Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have offered many Americans a new direction, not simply another candidate. Both have called for a modern version of what Franklin D. Roosevelt called the Economic Bill of Rights. Medicare for all, tuition-free public education, universal daycare, a Green New Deal to generate jobs while addressing climate change. Both would tax the wealthy and corporations to make vital public investments in the common good. The other candidates, particularly Biden, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, and Mike Bloomberg, have scoffed at these ideas as too radical, too bold, too costly, too ambitious. They offer mostly a continuation of the politics that existed before Donald Trump disrupted the country. The problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't offer much hope for most Americans. Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. Warren objects to that label and says she's for making markets work. But this is a difference in labels, not in substance. Their agendas are remarkably similar. The direction they would set is the same. Some already have started to frighten people about the label the democratic socialist. Trump paints it as Venezuela or Cuba. Mike Bloomberg called Sanders and presumably Warren's views on taxing wealth communist. Voters are going to hear a lot more of this nonsense if Sanders continues to build momentum or Warren catches fire. Here's the reality. The important word in democratic socialism isn't socialism. It's democratic. Sanders isn't talking about making America into Cuba or Venezuela. He's talking about extending social guarantees like those offered in most other advanced industrial states. invoking Denmark or Sweden. These countries have universal health care at lower cost, paid family leave, guaranteed paid vacations, higher minimum wages, more generous public retirement programs. They also have vibrant and competitive economies, lower inequality, less poverty, and higher life expectancies. Sanders is seeking a popular mandate from voters to move in this direction. When you think of democratic socialism, remember the programs that Republicans and conservatives and the corporate lobbies denounced as socialistic when they were first considered. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, environmental and consumer protection, banking regulation to protect consumers. The Federal Aviation Administration, which manages our nation's civil aviation and international waters, is a state program. The Food and Drug Administration, which ensures that drugs are safe, is a state program. The minimum wage, food stamps, public housing could all be considered democratic socialist programs. Our problem has been that we have too much socialism for the rich and the powerful. Subsidies for corporations, get-out-of-jail-free cards for crooked bankers, tax breaks for the rich that leaves them paying lower tax rate than their secretaries, monopoly power for corporations that allows them to gouge customers, and more. And we have too little shared security, democratic socialism, for working people, affordable health care, a living wage, guaranteed paid vacation and family leave, universal child care, affordable college, public mobilization to deal with the threat of climate change. When I ran for the presidency, I didn't use the label, although some tried to slur me as a socialist or a communist, but I don't think the label makes any difference. The question is one of direction, not name-calling, of program, not posturing. And on this, Dr. Martin Luther King, often smeared as a red or communist, was very clear. In 1966, he confided to his staff, quote, "You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you are messing with folk then. You're messing with captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water, because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. So put aside the fear-mongering and the red-baiting. Take a look instead at the substance. There's no question we need big structural change, as Elizabeth Warren puts it. We need better distribution of wealth and a greater protection of basic human rights, like the right to affordable health care, as Senator Sanders argues. Call it capitalism with a conscience, democratic socialism. Call it lemonade. It's the substance, not the label, that counts. And that will wrap up this episode of Bernie-2020. Remember, if you want to check out all the back episodes, you can go to Bernie-2020.com. You can follow me on Twitter at BernieUS2020. You can also watch and listen to me record this podcast live on twitch.tv. That is twitch.tv/unrelatedthings. Here is Max Romeo with the song Socialism is Love. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.
You're asking what is socialism and what it really means. It's equal rights for every man, regardless of his strength. So don't let no one fool you. Joshua said, Listen as I tell you, Joshua said, no man no better than none. Socialism is love between man and man. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Would you believe me? Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Socialism is
people pulling together.
Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Mr. Bigger trembling in his shoes, saying he's got a lot to lose. Don't want to hear about sufferer at all.
Joshua said,
one man have too many, while too many have too little. Socialism don't stand for that, don't stand for that at all. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and heads.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Socialism is
people pulling together.
Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Do you believe me?
People pulling together.
Oh,
love and togetherness. That's what it means.
Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing